Well, welcome, Dr. Nina. How are you?
Thank you. I am great. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Yes, and I mean, this is our second conversation. I was on your show on LA Talk Radio, and now, you're returning the favor of honoring me as a guest on my show, and I couldn't be more excited for this conversation.
I love reciprocity. It's wonderful to be here. It was wonderful to have you on my show, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, this is what we have to do as women, right? We have to help each other out. It's not a zero-sum game. We have to build each other up, give each other platforms, and when tides rise, all boats rise. So very excited.
Ooh, that's a good quote.
I cannot take credit for it. I heard it somewhere else, but thank you. So before we jump in, I have my intro for you, but just in your own words, tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a psychoanalyst. I'm a radio show host. I'm an author. I'm a coach. God, I drink too much coffee. I've written. I write academically, and I write mainstream books about eating disorders. I'm a psychoanalyst in private practice, and my specialty is eating disorders. For nearly 22 years, I have only treated people who struggle with all eating disorders, but mostly binge eating and bulimia. And a few years ago, I started to even subspecialize in binge eating disorder. And so my book, The Binge Cure, is specifically for mainstream readers about that. I have a LA Talk radio show about that. And basically everything that I do, I have coaching programs. I see people all over the world. Everything that I do is geared to helping people really liberate themselves from binge eating disorder by focusing not on what they are eating, but on why.
Yes. And that is the core question, is not the behavior necessarily, but why are you exhibiting those behaviors? So for our listeners who maybe don't know, they know me as an intuitive eating coach, and I deal with a lot of clients who do have binge eating disorder. But what exactly does a psychoanalyst do? How is that different? What do you focus on specifically?
Well, I deal with the psychology of eating, not with food. So I don't really help people make food choices. I make it, I guess the best analogy is a weed and a root. So if you look at the weed as food issues, which they're not even food issues, but I'll get into that later. What feels like food issues, dieting, focusing on food, all of those things, if you just pluck the weed, it will grow back. You've got to get to the root, which is underground. We can't see it, but we know that it's there because it is growing the weeds. And so what I help people do, and I love that analogy because we similarly have thoughts, beliefs, ideas, automatic things going on in our minds, our hidden unconscious minds that are deeply rooted, and we're in the dark about them. I help people bring that into the light, find new ways of recognizing why they're doing what they're doing, first of all, and then help them create new ways of responding to themselves instead of using food as a way of coping, distracting, numbing, all the things that it does.
Okay, great. So going forward with that analogy, we'll keep that analogy because I think it's a wonderful analogy. I use it as well. So what are the weeds that we see? What are some of the behaviors that we see that we could consider the weeds, the things that we see ourselves doing as binge eaters?
Dieting, binging, focusing on food, thinking about food, thinking food is the problem. What I tell people is, look, food is not the problem. Eating is not the problem. It is the solution to the problem. The problem is something that is going on in your mind, either what you are aware of or what you're not aware of, which can make it tricky. And I have that sounds like a very esoteric thing, but let me give you an example. So I had a patient come in and she told me, hey, Dr. Nina, maybe some of your other people struggle with emotions. That's how she put it, like emotions. She tells me she's like, I am a food addict and I can prove it. So I said, oh, okay. I'm all ears, prove it. So she tells me that the night before she'd been watching TV, everything was fine, nothing was bothering her. And all of a sudden, as she put it, Ben and Jerry's was calling her name. She's like, calling my name. I'm addicted to Chunky Monkey. I said, well, hold on. Let's just wait a moment. Well, what were you watching on TV before Ben and Jerry started calling? And she tells me it's her favorite show, her favorite like guilty pleasure, Charmed. And so because she was doing something she enjoyed, there was no reason, or so she thought, that she'd want to just down a pint of ice cream. So I said, okay, well, what was the episode about? Well, it's when this demon comes down and breaks the bond between the sisters and they start fighting and everything gets really nasty and horrible and contentious. And she stopped and she looked at me and I looked at her. And in that moment, we both knew what had happened. I said, oh, sisters fighting, huh? She's like, oh my gosh, I see what happened. She had a terrible relationship with her sister. Watching the show activated intense feelings about their relationship, but before that could reach conscious awareness, she went to ice cream for comfort and distraction. And then she could get mad at herself for eating ice cream when who do you think she's really mad at in her life? Her sister. So that is an example of how we are often affected by what's in our unconscious mind. Right? Before it reaches conscious awareness, we take action. It's out of awareness, but not out of operation.
Absolutely. Wow. That is such a story. So yeah, it's not like she was watching the show, thought of her sister, and then went to the Chunky Monkey. It was just the episode, her sister, and she didn't even realize the bridge between the two.
It was watching TV. And then it was ice cream. She had no idea she was being triggered. And that's why I tell people, look, you may think you're being triggered by food, but you are being triggered by some situation, some thought, something going on within you. And turning to food is the solution to that. And I have another example of our unconscious mind that really has to do with my own experience and how I came into this work, which is that when I was 5 years old, I suddenly and seemingly randomly decided that I was too fat. I was totally skinny, normal kid, actually, like even on the skinny side. But I decided that my legs were too fat for some reason. And this began my descent into really eating disorder hell. So by the time I was a teenager, like every page of my journals were numbers. It was like calories I ate, calories I burned, the weight I was, the weight I was going to be one day after this diet. And I was always on some crazy restrictive diet. And of course, eventually my willpower would fail and I would like eat the kitchen. And sometimes I would purge. So I considered myself the poster child for eating disorders because I had all of them. And I finally went to therapy, but I went for anxiety. I never told my therapist the truth about what was going on with food because I was too mortified. Like, it was too embarrassing. I was too ashamed. Nobody knew the truth. And yet, by the time I left treatment, all my eating disorders were gone forever. And not once had I ever talked about what was actually happening with food. My therapist had no idea she was actually treating the poster child for eating disorders. So people say, like, how is that? How is that possible? How do you get over all eating disorders without ever talking about food? And the point is, the problem was never food. The problem was my relationship with myself, which was highly toxic. I had to turn my inner critic into a friend, essentially. And when I did that, everything changed. And by the way, why at age 5 did I suddenly decide that I was too big when I was actually just a perfectly normal weight kid? Well, my parents are both academics, they're both college professors, and they're very sort of scholarly. And I was not. I was a kid. And I was always being told, like, oh my God, you're too sensitive, you're too loud, calm down, you're so dramatic, like, you're too much, was basically the message. And in my 5-year-old mind, which of course 5-year-olds are very concrete, my 5-year-old mind turned "you're too much" into, oh, there's too much of me. And maybe if I were somehow smaller, I would be more acceptable. And so both of these really points to how important psychology is when it comes to behavior. Eating disorders, binge eating is not the problem. It is a solution to the problem. The key is to figure out what is the problem and then find new ways of coping, responding, etc.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you mentioned the inner critic and turning your inner critic into a friend. What are some concrete steps that we can take to do that?
Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, one of my patients said to me that she looked in the mirror and she said to her reflection, "You're disgusting."
Oh,
Right? "You're disgusting." And I told her, what if you said that again, but from instead of a second person pronoun, what if you said that from an I place? Why don't you say "I'm disgusting"? And she's like, and she couldn't do it. She said it sounded too mean. And that's exactly the point. Because when we use the second person pronoun, when talking to ourselves, it's easy to be mean. It's easy to beat ourselves up, to be mean, to be critical and harsh. So if you ever say anything to yourself like, "You're disgusting, they don't like you, you're never gonna change, there's no hope for you, you're gonna fail," anything, those kinds of comments, well, that's your inner critic talking. And so the first step is to identify it. And even if you say nice things to yourself in second person, there's a huge difference between saying like, "Wow, you did that great. You did a great job," and saying, "Wow, I did a great job." When we talk to ourselves from the second person, it's distant, it's experienced distant, and we don't take it in as much. But when we say, I did a great job, we can feel it. It's more resonant. So first, look at your language. And this is a very simple thing. Once you're aware of it, most people cannot believe how often they talk to themselves in this mean second person voice. The second thing that you could do is look at the tone. Lots of times people will say, I talked to myself and it didn't help. And I'll say, well, like, what did you say and how did you say it? And they'll say something like this. Well, I told myself it's going to be okay. It'll be all right. I'm like, really? Would you say that to a friend? Would you say like, "It'll be okay, you'll be all right"? Like,
you'd be like,
no, I don't think so.
okay. You would have much more enthusiasm.
Right, the same words sound completely different when you say, "Hey, you know what? You're going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You're going to be all right." So a kind tone is like a verbal hug, whereas a monotone is like cold water. It does nothing for you. It does nothing to help. So those two things, really watching the tone and watching the tense, and also if you wouldn't say it to a friend or someone you love and care about, do not say it to yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But to create change, you really have to also look at where it comes from, because a lot of times, people have a hard time relinquishing that voice because it feels like the truth. I have a woman in my coaching group who was always told, she came in apologizing, "I'm so stupid. I know I'm so stupid. I know I'm not very bright. I know I'm not." And I'd say, where do you get this idea? "Well, I was always told, my parents always told me, that I was the stupid one." And she was just using her parents are no longer with us. She's like in her 60s. She was still talking to herself with their voice. And sometimes we really have to look at where this voice comes from and challenge it and deconstruct it so that it can go away. It was her way, in a way, she was connected to her dead parents by talking to herself with their voice, but That's some deeper psychoanalytic stuff. I won't get into that.
Yeah, but it's true. I always say that, like, whose voice is talking? When you hear these voices, they're not all yours. They might sound like yours after so many decades of hearing the same message over and over, but it might not have come from you. Typically, it doesn't. So you went into that wonderful charm story, which I thought is just so fascinating. But I want to get a little bit more into different types of weeds that, different types of roots that we might uncover. So what are some of the other roots that you see when you work with your clients? What else is kind of underneath the surface sometimes?
Shame and guilt. And often they think they're guilty when they're really feeling shame. So guilt, we feel guilty when we're doing something we don't want to do, like eating a whole box of Girl Scout cookies, or not doing something we want to do, like going to the gym. Say, oh, I feel so guilty that I did that, or I feel so guilty that I didn't do that. So guilt is more, although it's not good, it's more benign than shame, because guilt references behavior. I shouldn't have done that. I should have done that. Shame is feeling bad about yourself. So shame is, what's wrong with me that I ate the box of Girl Scout cookies? Clearly, there's something wrong and deeply flawed in me. That's shame. What's wrong with me that I can't do this or that? And why shame is so toxic and pervasive is if you feel that there is something essentially wrong with your very being, you might turn to food to get away from your own mean voice. And that's why it's essential to really look at the origins of shame. And usually, as in all our problems in our current functioning, they start in the past. Now, this is not about, let's look at the past and talk about the past. Because I've had a lot of people come to me and they've said, hey, I spent 20 years in therapy talking about what happened to me and I'm no better. And I say, yeah, of course you're no better, because there has to be a bridge to that happen. And as a result, this is affecting how you feel now and how you see the world now. So the origins of shame, and I should also say that approximately 30% of people who struggle with eating disorders have some kind of childhood sexual abuse. So it's very common for people to have an abuse background, especially sexual abuse, but whatever kind of abuse that happens. And there are different, there's a continuum, because a lot of people will say, well, I wasn't abused, I wasn't traumatized, I wasn't, like nothing terrible happened. But there are two kinds of trauma. One is big T trauma, which is a terrible, 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 awful thing happens. And that's like a butcher knife to your heart. Or there are the 1,000 small cuts, which are equally painful. So 1,000 cutting remarks can be equally as traumatic as one terrible abusive event. And what kids do, because kids are naturally egocentric, kids do not have the wherewithal to say, hey, this happened to me, or these people who are supposed to make me feel safe are actually hurting me. What's wrong with them? Said no kid ever. Really, kids say, what's wrong with me that they're treating me this way? They configure often abuse for punishment. Oh, I must be really bad if they're treating me this way. I must be something wrong with me if they're talking to me this way. And this is actually a strategy for hope, as strange as that may sound, because kids think, well, if I could just figure out what's wrong with me and make myself right and good, then I'm going to be getting the treatment that I want and deserve. Yeah. And this strategy for hope becomes a conviction that there's something just nebulously wrong with you. So it becomes an adult who thinks like, there's something strangely wrong with me. I don't know what it is, but I feel like there's something wrong with me. Oh, it's my weight. If only I could be this size, if only I could stop this, whatever's going on with food, then I'm going to be okay. I will get rid of the shame by getting rid of the weight. And this is an illusion that is also influenced by diet culture, which says, hey, if you lose weight, you're going to gain a different life. right? You'll lose all the things you don't like about yourself by losing weight, when that is absolutely not true. That is an illusion, but it's a $60 billion business, and that's what keeps it going. So those are the origins of shame. But again, it's hidden. People aren't thinking like, well, I thought there was something wrong with me. And now people just think I have to lose weight and somehow I'll be better.
Right. Right. Well, because it's been a narrative that's now been hardwired into their brain. And as you said, when we're children, when we're forming this narrative, our parents can do no wrong. They are the authority. So they must be right and we must be wrong. And then we never challenge that narrative because we just grow up believing that that's true. And I think, and I'm sure you see this as well, a lot of people that suffer from eating disorders also have a lot of people-pleasing tendencies.
Which is a trauma reaction.
Yeah.
So the trauma reactions are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And flight may be to food. Many people say to me, why food? This one woman said to me, why am I addicted to food? I mean, I don't believe in food addiction, as you could tell, but she's like, why am I addicted to food? Because she felt addicted. She said, why can't I be addicted to meth? At least I'd be skinny. And she was serious, which is probably one of the most painful things I've ever heard. And what I told her, and what I'm going to tell your audience, is that as babies, as infants, when we're first born, our first experience of being fed is being, held in someone's arms, wrapped in a cozy blanket, the gaze of the parent looking down at us with loving eyes. Everything is blissful and safe and happy and fabulous, and that gets associated with being fed. So somewhere in our unconscious minds, food equals relationship. So when we talk about comfort food, we're really talking about a wish to be comforted. We also, our vernacular has so much of this correlation. Like we say, we're starving for affection or hungry for love. Like there's such a connection between food and people. But when people are unpredictable and unreliable and unavailable, that's scary. Food, which represents people, is always predictable, reliable, and available. So often we learn to have more of a relationship with food and our bodies than with people.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so funny. You always see, or I at least always see, like on Facebook, people who are in the dieting world will show that the two brain scans next to each other, one of it is sugar and one of them is cocaine. And it's like, it lights up the same dopamine receptors. I'm like, yeah, so do hugs.
Yes.
So do hugs.
There was this study in 2011, I think it was, and they played classical music. And they showed that people listening to classical music, it lit up the exact same centers of their brain as cocaine. So any pleasure in your life will, of course, light up your brain, anything. And as for it being more addictive, for sugar being more addictive than heroin, and they'll say like these rats went to sugar and not heroin. Like, of course, rats are not motivated to get high. Rats don't want to get their buzz on. Rats are motivated by survival. They want sugar. And often in those studies, those rats were starved. I mean, they really, some of those studies really manipulated things. So the rats, of course, are going to go to sugar. They're motivated by survival, and sugar is food. Heroin is not.
Yes. Yeah. It's so funny. I know the study that you're referring to it's probably the same one. It's one that I speak about in my coaching, or where the study really doesn't show that the rats are addicted to food. The study showed that if you restrict food in any living thing, it's going to binge on whatever food source it's given, Oh my God, I could talk to you forever. This is so, like, I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, oh my God. I do want to ask two more things. First, I want my audience to know everything about your LA Talk radio show so they can start tuning in. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, it's called the Dr. Nina Show, Outsmart Emotional Eating. And it's every Wednesday on LA Talk Radio at 11 a.m. But don't worry, if you miss the live show, which if you can always call into the live show, by the way. If you miss it, it is available on Apple Podcasts and anywhere where you get podcasts. Just look for the Dr. Nina Show, Outsmart Emotional Eating. And I have been doing it for almost 6 years. So there are almost 6 years of content there that are available.
Very awesome. And last question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, because the show is called Finally Free Podcast. What does it mean to be finally free to you?
Well, one of the things that I say when I introduce my radio show is I say, hey, I want you to wake up and think about your day, not your diet. And that pretty much sums it up. Finally free. And I talk about liberation, which means, hey, this is something that you used to do. It is not your identity. It is not who you are. It's not a behavior you were always going to have to think about. You are not in recovery. You're free. You're liberated. You can wake up and think about your day, not your diet. That's freedom.
I love it. I love it. We're going to put it in the show notes, but tell everybody where they can find you.
Almost everything that I've been talking about is available on my website, Dr. Nina Inc., DrNinaInc.com. And you can also find me on Instagram. I have my main account is dr.nina.psychoanalyst. I should have made that shorter, but it's too late now. And then there's the.binge.cure, which really has to do specifically about my book, The Binge Cure, and tips and strategies that you can get there. And I'm on TikTok. I'm on YouTube. I'm everywhere. So just write me. I also will say that I respond to all my mail personally. So if you ever have any questions or just feel free to shoot me an email.
I can attest to that because I DM'd you one day and you just got right back to me and we formed a little friendship and I love it so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Nina, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.